Time to make juice. Beetlejuice. It's gross. Hi everybody. Today I am going to attempt to make a 1/12 scale posable doll with epoxy sculpt. So I've never used this product before, so it's going to be an experiment with a new product, trying to make something I've never made before, and I'm also going to be testing out a tool that was sent to me later in the video. I am going to be making Beetlejuice the doll, and this is going to be the main doll, or one of the main dolls for my project coming up, which will be the Beetlejuice house. So I'm very excited to start with the doll this time because with the Addams Family house, I did the dolls last. I feel like starting with the dolls will give me a lot of inspiration for making the rooms just as kooky as the dolls. So without further ado, let's get started. So of course I'm going to be starting out with a sketch of what I want to create. Underneath the paper that I'm drawing on, I have a 1/12 scale figure printed out. I just found like a human proportion chart and printed it so that the human figure was 6 inches tall. I'm tracing over the figure so that it has general shapes that I want to create when I am making the doll in 3D. Once I have the general shape for all the pieces and where I want to put the joints in, I am using a green pen to plan out my strings. Because I want him to be posable and the arms to be movable, I'm using elastic string, and these are what's going to hold all the body parts together. And so that's what I'm planning out with the green pen. I just wanted to use a different color so I could easily see where the strings are going to go. I also wanted to do a side profile of his torso because in the movie they very clearly stuffed his costume so he had a little belly, so I wanted to be true to that detail and add it in. I'm making sure that my pieces are the exact same length by adding the lines that go across, and here is my finished drawing. As I said in the intro, I am using epoxy sculpt. This is a new material to me. I saw Ace of Clay use something like this, and I was really intrigued to try it out, especially because it's supposed to dry rock hard. I won't have to worry about my sculpture breaking. I'm also using this elastic cord that you can get at just about any hobby store, usually like in the jewelry section. I'm also using these very thin coffee stirrer straws. They are going to basically be the bones inside some of the limbs that are going to act as a way for the elastic to be threaded through to hold the body together. As an example, I'll probably use 2 straws in the upper leg so that I can have the elastic go through both, like go down and then back up through the leg. I also grabbed this drawing model that I have. These are kind of expensive. I purchased them a while ago, and the thought did cross my mind to just like sculpt Beetlejuice's head on his body, but if I want to have multiple dolls in this project, that would get very expensive, so I'm just using him as a reference. He will help me make sure that all the body parts stay in 3D proportion. I'm going to be covering my workspace because I don't know how sticky this stuff is, and I'm following the directions on the bottle, which says to use gloves when you're mixing the 2 parts together. It also says to use separate tools when getting the 2 parts out, and so I'm just trying to be really careful on following the directions. I'm mixing it together for 2 minutes, and then I'm going to let it sit for a little bit as suggested on the bottle. I decided to write the times on the very edge of the paper, and so you can kind of see how long I'm letting things sit and how well the epoxy sculpt is working as the times go by. I'm paying close attention to the time chart on the side because working with things that have a certain working time, it gives me a little bit of anxiety. So keeping track of it this way also lets you know what's going on, and it helps me keep track of how long the items have been mixed. I mixed up this batch at 12:30 and I let it sit until 1 o'clock before I messed with it. I'm also not using gloves while I work with it. There are several different opinions on this. I decided to try it out because I feel like I sculpt a lot better without gloves, and I didn't find that I had any irritation, but I'll let you know in the end how it worked for me. I'm starting with the upper leg, and I'm going to put which body part I'm working on on screen so that you can kind of keep track, because some of the limbs start looking very similar. I'm going back and forth between my pattern that I drew out, trying to make sure I have enough clay or the right amount of clay to make the 3D shape that I'm trying to get. I did find at this point it was very, very sticky and it was hard to roll out. I flattened the amount of clay that I felt would work for the upper leg, and then I added the straws to the interior because those are going to be the bones. I'm pushing it down and starting to form it into the upper leg, or the thigh type shape that I'm going for. I'm going to be working on both legs at the same time because I want them to look as similar as possible. I'm going back and forth between my front drawing and my side drawing, trying to get the shape as close as I thought I needed it to be, but then I will be kind of working on it and changing it as I start to put the body together. In the past, when I have sculpted bodies, I tend to make things too big, and so checking it with 3D model is going to help me stay in 1/12 scale. One of the things that I found most intriguing about this product when I saw Ace of Clay working with it is that you can smooth it out with just water, and it does get very, very smooth. And I did want to say that on the directions it talks about using water to smooth out fingerprints, so that's where I kind of got it in my head that it was okay to use bare skin on this clay as long as it was after you had mixed the two parts together. But if you do have sensitive skin, just make sure you are taking care of your hands. I washed in between every time I touched the epoxy clay, and I made sure not to touch anything else. A little over an hour after I had originally mixed the clay, I came back to it, so this was about at 140, and it was much less sticky and it was much easier to handle. So I'm just going back and further pushing in my sculpting design and making sure that the top and the bottom of the upper leg are rounded off and looking neat. Once I'm happy with the shape, I'm going to clamp it and let it kind of sit off to the side so I make sure that I don't accidentally knock it over or touch it with anything. I'm also making sure one last time by putting the elastic string through the straw that I didn't crush the straw at any point and that it can still go through the limb once it's cured. After that first experience with the clay, I decided to mix up another batch, and this time I didn't even want to mess with it until it had sat for about an hour, and then I felt like it was a little bit easier to work with. Also, I want to make note, if you see these blue, this blue stuff on my hands, it's not from the epoxy, it's from a different project. Right now I'm working on the upper arms. It's going to be very similar to the upper legs, except of course smaller. I just flattened out the appropriate size amount of clay, laid the coffee stirrers inside and wrapped it around the coffee stirrers, and then I'm just making sure to check back with my drawing, and these were actually probably the easiest pieces to make. I'm also checking with my 3D model just to make sure I'm staying in scale. Now I'm going to be working on the shoulder and knee joints, and the knee joints I don't actually end up using, but I do use the shoulder joints. To put it simple, they just end up being like the shape of Cheerios, if you've ever had like a Cheerio cereal, and that's why later on I replaced the knees with some beads that are a similar shape, because when they got really small they were kind of wonky. But I'm just making a small little disc of clay and then putting a hole through it, and then I smashed one end so it kind of was like a wedged donut, and those will be the shoulder pieces, but you can kind of ignore the knee pieces as I replace them later. Now that I'm getting a little bit more confident with the epoxy sculpt, I'm ready to work on the lower leg. Now the lower leg does not need the coffee stirrer straws to go through it according to my plan, but I do end up using them because I want like there to be a structure within. So it does really act like a bone here, because the epoxy sculpt, until it hardens, can be very wobbly and it won't really hold its shape. So right here, these coffee stirrers are acting as a bone. I'm also using these jewelry jump rings. I'm putting 2 jump rings together for each lower leg, and what these are going to do, they're going to stick out of the top of the leg where the knee would be so that the string can go through and hold the lower leg onto the body. The reason I'm putting 2 together is because I'm kind of like an over gluer, so this is an over jump ringer type of thing. I know the epoxy sculpt is supposed to dry rock hard, and so it probably will be able to hold just 1 jump ring in place, but because this is the lower leg and it's going to be one of the heavier body parts, I'm putting 2 so that I have 2 jump rings fully encased in the epoxy sculpt with just a little bit of the top jump ring sticking out. This is really the only place I do this, and now after working with the epoxy sculpt, I don't really think the 2 jump rings is necessary. I'm checking this with my drawing. You can see that I have just a little bit of the ring sticking out of the top, and then I'm cutting off some of the excess epoxy sculpt at the bottom that I don't really need. Then I'm going to taper it down towards where the ankle would be and smooth it out, and later on I can cut off any excess, but for now I'm just trying to taper it so it looks more like an ankle, because this piece should be thicker at the top towards where the calf would be and thinner at the bottom. I'm using water to smooth it out, and then I will do the same for the other lower leg. The lower arm is going to be one of the skinnier limb pieces, and I was not even sure if I could get a coffee stirrer straw in there, and so I am just going to be using plain epoxy sculpt with nothing inside of it, and I'm cutting one of the ends open, kind of like string cheese when you like pull it in half, and I'm putting 1 jump ring in that end and then kind of closing the epoxy sculpt around that jump ring so it's just sticking out the top, one little bit of it sticking out the top, just like the lower leg was. You will see by doing this how floppy the epoxy sculpt can be when it doesn't have an interior structure, and so this was kind of a good experiment so that I could see how well using something inside the clay does work to keep its shape. So here is the arm shape. It is a little bit longer than it needs to be, but again, I was tapering it down the bottom just to make sure that it goes into a wrist shape. It should be thicker at the top where the jump ring is towards the elbow and thinner at the bottom where the wrist is going to be. And if it's a little bit long, I can cut it off later. I'm laying it down flat and trying to straighten it out so that as it cures, it does stay straight. I'm using the same lump of epoxy sculpt that I had mixed at 155. It's now 4 p.m. I had some left over, so I decided to start trying to sculpt the pelvis, which is going to become the structure for the rest of the torso. I'm making this V shape, or it kind of looks like one of those like really low cut bathing suits. It's kind of a weird shape. Anyway. And then I'm making sure that it has room for the upper legs on either side. It's also beginning to create the walls for the cavity that's going to be created where all the strings will be tied within the doll's body. Once I'm happy with the shape, I'm going to take a pokey tool and start making some holes where the strings from the upper legs are going to have to enter the body. It's going from where the leg joint is going to be all the way up to the interior. I also added some straws in there. While it cures, I want to make sure that these holes don't close up. Now it is about 8 p.m., so it's 6 hours after I mixed this epoxy, and I wanted to come back and see how much I could mess with it. It is pretty stiff. There's not going to be any extra sculpting I can do, but I can cut through it fairly easily at this point. It's kind of like cutting through a hard eraser, and so any bits that I want to take off with an X-Acto knife, this is a great time to do it. I'm also going to be removing any excess straw from the upper leg or any of my other pieces that have cured so I can start seeing how this body is going to fit together. Here are all the body pieces I made on the first day. I wanted to lay them out just to see what I had, and I wanted to also string together at least one leg so I could figure out if this was even working, if this was something that was going to be possible. I didn't want to mess with it too much because, as you will see in my hand, you can see I can still squeeze the pelvis into a different shape, and because it's still not completely cured. So I do need to be mindful of that. And I'm being very gentle with how I'm holding the string. I'm not pulling it too tight because I don't want anything to come undone, but it is cured enough to where I can show that yes, this is proof of concept that the legs will go together. I'm also seeing that I'm having an issue with the legs kind of popping out to the side. And this is because of the shape of the pelvis, which I will refine, and I continue to refine later on with some sanding, which I will show you. I realized before everything cured completely, I needed to cut off the bottom of the lower legs. I'm cutting it off right where the heel would be, and so tomorrow I plan to sculpt the rest of the foot onto the leg. But before it completely cures, it's going to be easier to cut it off at this point than later on. I'm doing the same thing with the hands. I'm cutting it off a little past where the wrist should be, and then once it's completely cured, I can sculpt the hands straight onto the wrists. It is now the following day and everything is pretty much cured. I mixed together this lump of epoxy sculpt at 9:30 and I started messing with it at 10:30. I'm going to use this to start building up the torso, which is going to contain these jump rings. These are double jump rings, so they're wrapped around twice. So I'm hoping they'll be a little bit stronger and able to hold the tied strings, which I will show you at the end. I'm pushing out a little belly shape, and then I'm going to use the pelvis as a tracing line to trace it into the shape that will sit on top of the pelvis. I'm just going to use an X-Acto to go around and cut through the epoxy sculpt. It is a pretty sticky substance, so I get the general shape and then I have to pick it up off my mat to actually take the shape out of the lump. So you can see it still is pretty sticky even an hour after being mixed. I'm placing this straight on top of the pelvis, and what's going to be made in the back is the start of the cavity where all of the strings are going to be tied. I'm going to use my fingers to start to join the front belly part of the torso and the pelvis in the back. Once I have it all smoothed out in a shape that I like, I'm going to lay it on the belly onto the desktop, and I'm going to start inserting the jump rings. I'm going to have 5 total jump rings because I am going to have 5 strings that are attaching the different parts of the body. I'm using pliers to initially push the jump ring into the epoxy sculpt, and then I am adding a little bit more epoxy sculpt just underneath the jump ring and then smoothing that into the rest of the body, and this is going to ensure that it is truly encased in the epoxy so that when it does cure, it is held in place. I'm putting these 2 just above where the leg strings are going to come through, so they'll be easy to tie. And then I am adding 2 near where the arm strings are going to come in. And I'm adding the last one right in the middle where the head string will come down through the body. I'm smoothing everything out so that the bottom half of the jump ring is completely encased in epoxy sculpt. And that's how I'm kind of organizing this interior cavity. I'm checking again with my drawing just to make sure it's the right size. And then I'm going to lay out a kind of long rectangular piece that's going to start building up the rest of the walls of the cavity to protect the jump rings and form the body. I'm going to smooth those in, and it's also going to kind of start building up the shoulders and the area where the head is going to sit on top of the body. I did decide to add on some shoulder pieces. These are just kind of wedge shapes that I want it to kind of look like a shoulder, but then I was thinking that my arms may not be able to go straight up if I have such defined shoulders. So even though I'm adding these on now, later on I do end up cutting them back off and then shaving them down even a little bit more when I get to the sanding phase. I'm using a paintbrush here with water because I'm trying to get into some small areas, but the water technique has worked great. It is a very, very smooth sculpt. So there you see I cut off the shoulders just after I had put them on, but I do think that that was to my benefit. While I'm waiting for the torso to get a little bit further into its curing process, it's about 11 o'clock now, I'm working on the hands. I laid out just a oval shape of clay, and I'm starting to cut an L shape in one side, and then I'm cutting down an area for the fingers and cutting the finger pieces, and then I'm just going to cut the pinky a little bit shorter, and voila, a hand. I got a lot of practice making thing for the Addams family. I'm still not great at it, but it is a little bit easier than it used to be. I added little tiny balls of clay where the knuckles were supposed to be, and then I am going over it with a paintbrush with water so that everything gets smooth together. Then I am shaping the hand just a little bit into the shape I want it to be, and then I'm sticking it onto the end of the wrist, and then I'm going to smooth the epoxy sculpt over the cured wrist so that it can start forming into one piece. I feel at this point I can safely say that I did not have any skin irritation when working with the epoxy sculpt. I did have a couple times where I felt like I needed to just use some lotion on my hands, but for me I didn't have any issues. But if you do have sensitive skin, just make sure that you are very careful. I'm now going to be working on the feet, and to do this, again, I'm just cutting like a little oval of clay that's about the right size. I'm going to push a half moon shape into one side and then put it on the ankle and then sculpt it around the foot so that I have a foot shape. I am later on going to be making his shoe, so right now I just want something that I can build the shoe around. I want to note at this point that it is important for you to figure out which way your lower leg fits on your body and make sure that your foot is facing the correct way, because I had to fix mine. Now that the torso has cured a little bit further, I'm taking that same pokey tool and I'm making holes for both arms, and I will be making a hole for the head in the top because it's cured a little bit more. I don't feel like I'm taking it out of shape as much as if I had tried to do that when I first built the top part of the torso. I also want to take a rounded tool and push in where the head hole is because I want to make a neck joint and I want to have a hole for that neck joint to sit in. So I'm taking this sculpting tool, which has a rounded back end, and pushing in so that I have a little divot where that hole is so that the neck has a place to rest. All right, so as you can see, there's only one body part left to make, and it's the hardest one. I mixed this up at about 12:30. I am using it at 1 o'clock just because I was starting to be impatient on all the wait times. But yeah, so here we go with the head. I'm starting with an oval that is about the right size, about the right amount of clay. And this one I'm also going to be putting straws inside of because the head needs to be attached to the body with a two-way string system, which I will show you. So I'm putting 2 straws inside of the head. They do get a little bit loose as I sculpt on the head, but I will glue them in later. I smooth it all out and I'm ready to start with my sculpting. Now this is where the tool comes in that I told you I was going to test out. I was sent this item by Carson. They sent it to me. It's the OcuLens OL57, and they let me pick something off of their site that I could test out, and I really liked this one because it clips onto your glasses and it will magnify things. So as a miniaturist, that's really helpful. I did want to let you know that they did send this to me for free, but I did let them know I would be giving my honest and true opinion about this product. I do like the fact that it's very lightweight. I get a lot of headaches whenever anything besides glasses is on my head, like a headband. And so the fact that it's really light and sits on top of my glasses is really appealing to me. One thing I did notice right offhand is it's a little difficult to change out these lenses. So if you do have hand pain or hand issues, that might be a problem for you, but they are very secure once they are attached. So I'm going to be trying this out myself while I am sculpting the Beetlejuice head. And this is how it looks when it is on. So super stylish. But I do like that it's kind of out of the way. Like I don't feel like I have a helmet on my head while I'm working on something. And I did realize it does have to be pretty close to my face while I'm working. So as I'm sculpting, obviously I'm sculpting up really close to my face. I'm not really going to be showing you each step I go through to get the facial features on the head. There are so many great face sculpting tutorials out there, but I will tell you I have not followed one face sculpting tutorial where I got to the end and it was like perfect. So it's definitely a learning process, and especially when you're sculpting in 1/12 scale, many of the face sculpting tutorials I found, they are sculpting on much bigger heads, like at least heads that are like the size of a tennis ball, when we're working on a head that's the size of a grape. So if you're wanting to sculpt a head, give yourself time, give yourself the ability to be frustrated and mess up. And yeah, so this is the first face that I came up with. And I tried really, really hard to convince myself that I liked it and that it was in scale, even though it was not. It's a little bit too big. I also made a neck joint that ended up being kind of like a cylinder bead. It's rounded on either end with a hole in the center. I don't know why I didn't really record that. But in the end, I decided to make a second head. My goal through this whole thing was to stay in scale. You can see it is just slightly smaller, and it is much more in scale when I matched it with my 3D model. So I do suggest, if you are going to try this for yourself, give yourself time to sculpt multiple heads until you get one that you like. I'm now putting the whole thing together, and I'm going to be marking out some places that I think need to be sanded down so that the body will move and work a little bit better. At this point, all the pieces have mostly cured, so cutting through it with my X-Acto knife would be incredibly difficult, and I don't want to re-sculpt anything, so if I can sand it off or shave it down so that it works, that's what I'm going to do. According to the package instructions, you need to make sure you're in a well-ventilated area and have a face covering while you sand the epoxy sculpt, because there is dust that goes up into the air. I'm using my Dremel with a grinding tool on the end, and this worked really, really well. It took it off slowly enough that I could keep control of what I was doing, but quickly enough so I didn't feel like I was spending hours sanding things down. I'm sanding the inside of the thighs so that it works a little bit better in the body area, and I sanded down the top of the shoulders. And I noticed you could see my Batman Christmas socks. After I get everything inside, I'm going to wipe it down so that I don't have any of that epoxy dust getting all over my workspace. And then I'm going to do one last temporary string to make sure everything is working after I had sanded it down. I will show you the permanent stringing and how all that works towards the end of the video. But I like how the legs move much better. Again, it's not perfect. They kind of flip out a little bit, so it's still a learning process, and this is why ball jointed dolls are expensive, because it's complicated to make a human body out of plastic and get it to move correctly. So it's a learning process, but so far I am extremely happy with this movement. It does over move, so it can do things that a human body cannot do, but for a 12 scale doll, so far I'm pretty happy. I was also very happy that I accomplished my goal, that I stayed in scale. As you can see with laying the doll over the drawing, I felt like I was a lot more focused on scale this time, and he fits. I'm going to take all the pieces that need to be painted, put them on a string, and I'm going to do a base coat of Mr. Super Clear or any kind of primer that will help you paint on top of a smooth surface is going to help here. If you're not familiar with the movie Beetlejuice, he is basically a rotting corpse, so what I'm about to paint is kind of gross, but he has a very, very pale skin complexion. Oh, and then I put this back on so I could paint his face details. I did find with this OcuLens that I had to have whatever I was working on pretty close to the lens for me to see it. I think this would be super helpful in something that was like 1/48 scale or smaller, but I did wish that I could hold it a little bit further away from my face. But I do think I'll be putting this item in my toolkit when I go to hopefully miniature classes again someday. So yeah, I really did enjoy that piece, and I felt like I could get a little bit closer with my details. I hope you can see in the video I added some teeth inside his mouth, and the OcuLens did help me get in there and paint those details. They're really, really tiny. Beetlejuice does have some decay on his face, and so I'm using my ball-pointed tool to go and add the decay in the different places that I see in the movie. And then he has these very purple circles around his eyes, very distinctive circles, so I added those in, and then I'm doing some of the same techniques on his hands. I'm not going to be doing any other painting on the rest of his body because eventually he will be covered in clothing. So now I'm going to show you exactly how I'm stringing the body together. I've done some temporary strings in the previous part of the video, but I want to show you exactly how this body goes together. First, I'm going to put a string through the jump ring that's coming out of the top of the lower leg. Then I'm going to take the small bead that I replaced for the knee joint, it's just like a donut shape, and I'm going to put both strings through that bead. Then I'm going to take the upper leg. There are 2 straws inside the upper leg, so make sure your foot is pointed the correct way once your strings go through both straws, and then pull it out the top. Then I'm going to take both of those strings and I am going to put it up through the torso cavity, making sure that the inner part of the thigh faces into the inner part of the torso. Once the strings are inside the body, you once again want to check and make sure your leg is facing the correct way. Then loop one of the strings through the jump ring that has been encased in the epoxy, and then tie it tight, double checking that you like how tight the leg is, or if you need to make it a little looser, a little tighter, this is the time to do it once you've only made one knot. When you like how loose or tight it is, do a double knot and then cut off the excess string. This is how my leg looks, and I'm going to do the exact same process for the other leg. Here you can see both leg strings are tied to the jump rings. So now we have legs. Moving on to the arms, they are done in a very similar way, where the string goes through the jump ring that's on the lower arm. Make sure that your thumbs are pointing inwards to the belly, and then you'll know that you have your hands on the correct sides. I don't have an elbow joint, so I'm just going to put the strings straight up through the upper arms, one string through each straw, and then add on my shoulder joint, which is that Cheerio shape. Then I can pass both strings through the cavity of the body, make sure that my arm looks correct and the hand looks correct. Then I can pass one of the strings through the embedded jump ring and then tie it off, again making sure whether the arm is too loose or too tight before I cut off the ends. I'm going to do the exact same thing to the other arm. Again, just make sure that that thumb is on the correct side of the hand and you're good to go. So lastly, we have to do the head. So when it came to the head, as you saw, some of the straws were loose and came out. Off camera, I glued the straws into the head. I just used some super glue, and then I put some felt over the edges of the straw because I don't know if they're sharp enough to eventually wear on my strings to where it would be cut in half. So I am going to be putting the string through each of the straws. There's 2 straws in there, and it's going to be looping over the top of the straws where I added the felt. So that's how it looks. Both strings are coming out of the bottom of the head. Then I can add on my neck joint, which ended up being about the size and the shape of a Lego man head, if you want to get the scale for it without the little lump on top. And then I'm going to pass both those strings through the hole at the top of the body, making sure that the neck fits into that little groove that we made for it. And then I'm going to tie it onto the embedded jump ring. And there we go. Now we have a head that can move and can look around. And everything is officially attached, although it wouldn't be hard to reattach it if for some reason something wasn't just right. I could just snip the string and start over. The last thing I'm going to do in this video, which is part 1, is give him his iconic hair. I'm using some faux fur and some glue. All I'm going to do is spread the glue wherever he needs hair, and I'm starting with the front hairline, which is kind of set far back. He has like a very tall, is it tall or just a wide forehead? I don't know if it's supposed to say tall forehead. I don't know. But he has a hairline that's set pretty far back. And then I'm going to cut off a clump of this faux fur and then stick it straight into the glue. Doing this hairdo really isn't hard except for the patience it takes for the glue to take hold of the individual hair pieces. I continue around the head, trying not to mess up the first area that I did, and I'm just adding glue anywhere he needs hair and letting it stick straight out, because that's kind of his hairstyle. It's just everywhere. A few times in the movie he kind of like tries to style it a little bit, but it's a pretty fun hairdo to try and recreate. Once the glue has dried, I'm going to take a hand vac and just kind of gently hover it over the hair so that anything that didn't hold on to the glue comes off and I'm not messing with a bunch of loose hairs. Then I'm just using my scissors to cut in towards the hair so that I don't get a straight cut at any point, and then I'm just trying to make it a good length. I'm using my shaved chalk pastel in the color green and black. I'm using both back and forth. I'm using a lot of green and just a little bit of black. When I dip into the black, I try to get most of it off of my brush, but I'm using this to create the grimy green hair that he is known for. I'm putting most of it at the base of the hair, and then it kind of gets a little bit whiter towards the outside. So at the very ends of his hair is not as green, and that's okay because that's kind of how it looks a little bit on camera. Now I'm using a mixture of water and tacky glue. It's mostly water. I don't want too much glue. And I'm going to be trying to give this hair just a little bit of style and shape. I don't want too much of that because it's supposed to look wild, but by doing this it will also kind of adhere some of the excess hairs that are sticking out all over the place together with that little bit of glue that's in the water, and I won't feel as nervous about hairs coming out. And then I'm also using a toothpick to kind of pull out little bits where I think it looks good and I have an even amount of chaos all over his head. So here is the final doll for now. So that's all I have for you today as far as our friend Beetlejuice goes. I will not be dressing him today. This video was long enough, as you could tell. I have already made a couple suits, one for Gomez, one for Lurch, but this will be a whole different type of suit that I need to make for him because he is posable. I have to make sure that it will work with a posable body, and if need be, I can get to his strings in the back. So it'll be a whole different way to design clothing. So that will be my next video. I also wanted to let you know that Carson, that sent me this product to try out, has offered to do a giveaway through my channel. So if you are interested in being part of the giveaway, make sure you leave a comment down below and just leave the word Carson somewhere in your comments so that I can search it and make sure that you are interested in the giveaway. Make sure you are 18 years or older and that you are willing to give me your name, email, and shipping address so I can give it to Carson to send you the product. And I will also leave that company's link and information down below if you're interested in checking them out and their other products. I hope you all have an amazing week, and I will see you in the next one. Bye. Okay, so we know we did this right if I can get his head to spin. ready? Oh my gosh.